Thank you, everyone. Well, thank you for being here. I wanted to dive in right away with a pretty low-ball question. It's pretty easy, right? What does it mean for something to be meaningful? Or what does meaningful mean to you? You can shout out answers. There's obviously no right or wrong answer.
Changes things.
What's that?
Changes things that I want to improve.
It changes things? Or how would you define something that's meaningful?
It has significance.
It has significance?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It achieves your purpose.
What's that?
It achieves your purpose.
It achieves your purpose.
Good impact.
Good impact, yeah. So these are all good, but this is a very difficult question, right? And I wanted to make a comparison, and this is probably not a super appropriate one, but Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart once defined, shall we say, videos meant for a certain audience that is definitely not K12. But he was like, it's very hard to define, but I know it when I see it. And I think meaningful, as we just experienced in this exercise, is very hard to define. But to me, I think I know it when I see it. And I wanted to give you an example, which some of you have heard me talk about many times. But this was a TV show that was very meaningful to me growing up.
They just look like they're in love. And who am I to say what is right or what is wrong? Look at this. Check it out. What a fantastic creature. I feel like I'm looking at a Muppet. In fact, this is a live, breathing chameleon, and it is the smallest species of chameleon in the world.
Feels like my skin is crawling with them. I can see them everywhere. These bugs.
Hey,
I kid.
because I love
bats. Isn't this cool?
So for those of you who don't know, this show is called The Jeff Corwin Experience. It was on Animal Planet. And I watched this show every day growing up. I grew up in the middle of Missouri. And I would watch his show, and then I would go outside and pretend to be him. I loved going to zoos. I loved fishing. I loved exploring my backyard. And a lot of this was instilled by the enthusiasm he had on his show of exploring the world around him. So I grew up loving the outdoors, loving wildlife, and it actually continued throughout high school. And I would say it's a big reason why I eventually came to MIT and studied bioengineering. So meaningful media is hard to define, but when I see the impact that this show had on my life, I do believe that videos can have profound impacts, especially on young people. So although meaningfulness is hard to define, I think in the context of creative media, we can think about it in two still very loaded words, which are measurable impact. And I don't mean this in the traditional educational research sense of, traditional experimental setups and controlled randomized trials. I mean it in a way that can help us start thinking about how measurable impacts helped MIT K12 videos process and come up with who we were and what we made and how we measured the impacts. And I wanted to talk about it so that at the end of this hour, you could come away thinking about two questions. How do I make media that's meaningful? Or how do I use media in a meaningful way? And my hope is that by the end of this xTalk, you will be able to either think about a piece of media that you would like to create, or be able to identify a piece of media that you've experienced in your life that was meaningful and be able to pinpoint why. So these are very big questions. So we're going to start with 8 that are much less overwhelming, that are much more manageable, and they're actually the 8 that I ask myself anytime I start a brand new project, especially with a video. So why should I make a video versus a print piece or an essay or a blog post or not making anything at all, which is a totally legitimate option, by the way. What's the point? Who's my audience? It can't be everyone. Your audience cannot be just anyone across the board. And these questions seem very limiting, especially during your ideation phase, but it was extremely important at a place like MIT, where our tendency is to think that we can do all the things, but in reality, you can't. You can't make a video that speaks to everyone, that builds competencies, that fundraises. It's not an effective approach. So having these seemingly limited questions that force you to evaluate the unique strengths and contributions that your team can make, I actually found very empowering. And I found it a powerful framework to think about not just our individual videos, but what our initiative was overall. So I'd like to focus on this actual framework of thinking and less on what our actual outcomes and products were, because I think this could apply to pretty much anyone sitting in this room. So speaking of K12 videos, for those of you who don't know, it's an educational media program that's currently in the Office of Digital Learning. And we basically have 4 arms. Producing original web series, so videos like the physics of skydiving, could you engineer yourself to have wings? Doing outreach activities, going into middle schools, teaching them how to make science videos themselves, doing live versions of our videos. Doing a lot of training for students and staff on campus on how to communicate technical topics to non-technical audiences. And then contributing to our understanding of how informal media can facilitate learning. So we have a couple reports out on optimizing video for learning, using video production as a creative process for students, understanding the role of communities in online learning. And to make K12 videos what it is today, we went through each of those 8 questions. So number 1, there are some weaker reasons to make videos, and unfortunately they're the lower hanging fruit. So you see a lot of people diving into this medium because it's sort of a trendy thing, or we see that everyone else is doing it. It's kind of a lemming approach. Sometimes the communication strategy is to engage a demographic that is on YouTube, and that is a better reason why to make a video, but I always ask the question why. Why is that your target audience? Why do you want to experiment? This is where we start moving into some more compelling reasons to make videos, and in particular this last one, that it provides a window into a world that's otherwise inaccessible. So in 2010, there were a couple things that happened that were a bit alarming. It should come as no surprise that science, tech, engineering, and math is woefully lacking in diversity. Only 10% of the engineering workforce is women, and only 10% are Blacks and Latinx. Lemelson did a survey in 2010 that showed that only 5% of teens here thought that engineers contributed something meaningful to society. And not that many people in the US are earning their degrees in engineering. So Ian Waits, who at the time was the Dean of Engineering, sort of thought, well, we have this problem and we have this incredible solution at MIT of these 10,000 students who can really inspire the next generation of STEM practitioners. So in 2011, they teamed up with Sal Khan to come up with MIT K12 videos. And the charge was to have MIT students teach K12 students science, tech, and engineering, and math through homemade videos. And that's what happened for the first 2 years of the program. So in the first 2 years, there were about 80 students, myself included, who produced over 100 videos. In 2012, MIT established the Office of Digital Learning with the vision that it would help extend the magic of MIT beyond this campus. So with things like OpenCourseWare and MITx, we moved into ODL in 2013, and that's when I took over. And since we've been in ODL, I've envisioned our role as extending a very special part of the magic of MIT to the world, and that's our students. So this is sort of where the pieces of who we are start coming together. We're here to extend MIT's reach to audiences that we traditionally don't necessarily hit. And we want to challenge the idea of who can be a scientist or an engineer by using our students as role models. But as you can see, there are still some pieces missing, and that's where the next 7 questions help us fill this in. So what's the point of my video? People often mistake the point with a topic. So it's good to have a topic for a video, like genetic engineering, for instance. But it's not quite the point of a video. So in the pilot rounds, most of the videos fell into traditional topics. And you'll see that only about half the students showed themselves on screen. And this was largely because this was a partnership with Khan Academy. So a lot of the videos looked like Khan videos. Not a lot of people showed resources that were sort of unique to MIT. And this is what happened when students were given free rein to make whatever they wanted. And part of the reason is it's really hard to make a video. It involves a lot of different fluencies. So a lot of the videos were topically driven. And again, that's okay. It's a good place to start, but it's not quite complete. A topic or a point is a topic plus why it's interesting. So there's this great book called Out on the Wire where Jessica Abel interviewed a bunch of podcast producers. And one of them is Alex Bloomberg, who used to produce Planet Money. And he talks about how a story is a topic plus why it's interesting. So the example he gives is the topic of encryption. As they were doing research, they found that the Center for Democracy and Technology, which is the advocacy group who encourages encryption, most of their staff doesn't actually encrypt their own files. And that's the sort of interesting part. And another way to approach points and stories is a phrase that I learned from Chris Babel, which is to make the familiar unfamiliar. So how do we take preconceived notions and help people see them in a newer, more curious light? So for example, here's this clip.
Paclitaxel is a compound that can treat cancer. Salicylic acid reduces headaches and fevers. Carotenoids can turn your skin orange, and miraculin changes your sense of taste. What do all of these awesome compounds have in common? They all come from plants! More than 100,000 natural compounds occur in plants, and we've barely explored them. These small molecules are called metabolites. Just like how all of the DNA in an organism forms the genome, all of the metabolites form the metabolome. Even though each metabolite can be made from only 6 elements, there are so many possibilities that it would take scientists thousands of years to make each one and figure out its usefulness. Luckily, plants have already done this for us. Plants have the disadvantage of being rooted to the ground. So, over time, they've trial and errored making lots of compounds to see which ones help them survive and thrive best. And because they've been interacting with other species, like us, for hundreds of thousands of years, some of their chemicals turn out to be really useful, both inside and outside our bodies.
So this clip is an example of a series that we launched in 2014 called Science Out Loud. And again, it takes this principle of how do we take things that people interact within their everyday lives or topics that kids encounter at school or in their textbooks, and how do we help them reframe it, make it unfamiliar, make it curious and interesting to them. So with the Science Out Loud videos, we took a much more intentional practice of encouraging students to think about the point of their videos in this way. It required much more training and time with them, with a professional production crew. And the big difference is that the students produce these in a cohort with fellow castmates in their season. So instead of making videos on their own, they're either workshopping them with each other in a intense 2 or 3 week workshop session, or they're doing it in a class that we teach. And these videos have both a topic, like fractals, which is hosted by Yulia up here, but there's also sort of an interesting, unexpected quality or point that comes across in the videos. And this is the breakdown of Science Out Loud. You'll see that there are many more videos that cover multiple disciplines. And we very intentionally required students to be on camera to show something that's unique, to open the world, or the window into the world of MIT, to show a demo. So you'll see that the format shifts a little bit with this approach. And not only did it signal a shift in the way we made videos, but it also signaled a shift in how we thought about the program overall. So the why it's interesting doesn't apply just to an individual video, but you could think of our program as having a topic for a while. It was that we were making these student-made videos, students teaching students, and it's a good place to start. A topic is an important place to start, but after the first couple years, we sort of identified why it's interesting. And again, going back to this idea of the student body here is very diverse. Our research at MIT in particular is cutting edge and bold, and our students are involved with all of this research. So it helps us to define our goals a little bit more, in particular, that we are intentionally highlighting students and staff of underrepresented minority backgrounds or female students and staff to help show that the door to science and engineering is open to anyone. And that we're here to spark curiosity. So our videos aren't here to necessarily build competencies to prepare students for tests. They're really here to make people excited about exploring their world. But to further define our goals and strategies, we have to keep going with the questions. So who's my audience and what do I want them to do? Specificity really helps you deliver more concretely delivered impact. Even though we say our general audience is middle to high school students, what we're really meaning is students who are sort of on the cusp of being interested in science and engineering and most importantly, students who are supported by their community. So they have parents who are either encouraging to watch these videos, or they have teachers who are showing them in class. We weren't particularly interested in capturing the totally disinterested, not because that's not an important demographic, but that's not where we identified the area that we would make the most impact. And our goal was to build curiosity for STEM, so not necessarily get them to become engineers, but just make sure that they knew the door to engineering was open to them. We wanted them to ask more questions, to watch more science videos, to share the excitement with their friends. So that really clarifies another strategy, which is to build agency among our viewers as potential STEM practitioners, to help kids think that they can see themselves as scientists and engineers if they want. So that's also why we added in the outreach programs in 2014. So having SciVids 101, which is a workshop where middle schoolers can learn how to make science videos, and K12 Live, which is where student hosts of our videos do live talks. And this specificity in audience really empowers our ability to have a deeper impact. So for example, our most viral video to date is on how braces work. Right now there's about 4.6 million views. And this video was targeted to teenage girls who have braces. The host of this show went through braces herself, and she could really relate to kids going through it. But what ended up happening was that the Mythbusters picked up the video and shared it. So we have pretty evenly spread out demographics, but I really don't believe that we would have had this audience had we tried to hit everyone going in. We had a very specific target audience when we produced it, and it ended up affecting a broader audience. I don't think it would have worked the other way around. And this video was produced as part of our inaugural IAP course on making educational media. So it's a 3-week boot camp where the students make their own videos, and we pick our favorites to produce for Science Out Loud. And part of the class is to write daily blogs, just sort of free-form thinking of what they're learning and how they're feeling. And one student wrote, "My biggest takeaway from this was what I set out to do from the beginning, get better at talking, specifically explaining difficult concepts in a simple way. I can already see changes in how I explain things to friends and family about what I do for research. My second biggest takeaway was learning how to be comfortable on camera, and generally being comfortable in front of complete strangers. I would advertise this as almost a Toastmasters because it really helped out my public speaking abilities." And it was reflections like this that really honed in our last goal and made us realize that our audience isn't just the people who watch our videos, but our audience, they're the students and faculty here. And one of our goals is to empower them, to give them a toolkit of communicating their research and technical topics to an audience outside of our bubble, so that if and when they do leave, they have the ability to carry on this mission forward. So this class complemented a lot of offerings at MIT on science writing, video production, public speaking, which brings me to the next question. We wanted to consider our space in the greater academic, multimedia, and educational media ecosystem, not only at MIT, but also on the web. So at MIT, I envision K12 videos as sitting on the lip of this funnel that's connected to things like the news office, OpenCourseWare, the academic departments, that eventually lead students to a big world of STEAM. But in the context of the web ecosystem, we identified peers to reflect on not only, what do they make and how can we be different, but also how can we learn from their best practices. So Nat and Lo is a web series that's produced by 2 Google employees where they go behind the scenes at Google. SciShow is a very popular YouTube science show, basically. And then Figure One comes out of the University of California. We can't be either one of these things, nor can we be a lot of the things that are popular on YouTube with science media. We don't have consistent hosts. Our hosts aren't necessarily naturally good on camera. We don't have the capacity of production like these other groups do. And we can't engage with and consistently post videos with our YouTube community. But what we do have are very diverse experts. They are very special. The students here, I think, it's sort of a commodity that no one else can say that they have. And then we do have access to the spaces and research that a lot of these other web series don't. So it's for that reason that we also launch 3 other web series in addition to Science Out Loud. We've got Ask MIT, which is a video pen pal series. So these were, I think, second graders in Missouri who asked why do stars twinkle and move. And then Anna Freebill, who's a faculty member in the physics department who does astronomy, answered. We did a couple videos with the technical services group on campus who do the 801 and 802 demos to do physics demos that most kids probably can't do in their high school classrooms. And then there's Q2, which is a talk show that we did with graduating seniors who come from underrepresented minority backgrounds. And then it's also why we proceeded with a few different series this year, which are coming out at the end of this year. We've got a series that we did with the nuclear reactor on campus. We collaborated with the Early Childhood Cognition Lab here on campus for a preschool animated series. And then we've got a reality series with some NASA researchers and a couple MIT students and staff, or students and faculty as well. So even though they look very different from Science Out Loud, they still capture the unique assets that we have at MIT with our diverse students with amazing interests. So how do we make these? There's a litmus test that I use, which is someone more uniquely positioned to make this video than we are? And if the answer is not really, then we can proceed with the 3 core pre-production principles. Spirit and Satan words, which is not an official term, it's just something that I coined. But basically, at the start of each production, I define what are the words that really capture the spirit and aesthetic and tone and vibe of what we're going for, and what are the words that are really, what we want to avoid at all costs. Satan words are not bad things inherently on their own, but for something like Science Out Loud, we wanted to avoid a feel that was corporate or lecture or dated. And in particular, we really wanted it to feel friendly. We still wanted to have a home-cooked feel, even if it was professionally produced. The team to make Science Out Loud is myself, and then we have a contractor to direct and edit. Of course, there's the students who are hosting, and then usually some sort of production assistant. And the big constraint is, Science Out Loud is special because it's very important that the students gain a deep, meaningful educational experience out of it where they feel trained to communicate with others. So it takes a lot longer than most videos. I think about 200 man-hours go into a 5-minute video. But it's very different than just hiring a professional actor or just getting a 5-minute interview with someone. Whereas Life After Earth, which is the NASA reality series, does have a very different tone and feel. Similar team, but very different set of constraints. We were out in Idaho for 2 weeks out in the field with this team, and it was very treacherous terrain. We don't get a chance to reshoot interviews with people, and there are a lot of people to interview. So we have a different set of constraints which informed a different aesthetic. And here's the trailer for that piece.
The moon is what got me interested in geology, so that's always been my first love. Just knowing it's just right there, you can go outside and see it.
And how close is the middle of Idaho to being there?
For me, it's probably as close as I'm gonna get.
There's a lot of evidence that Venus, Mercury, Earth, and Mars, and also the moon, when they first formed, were very similar to each other. So they started on the same path, and somewhere along the line, they just totally veered off in different directions. How did that happen? Why did that happen? What does that mean for the future evolution of our planet?
We're doing some pretty good exploration already with robots on Mars. Why do we want to send humans? When you actually get down and dirty into the planetary surface, there's a lot of things that humans can do that robots can't do at all. And that's what we're learning to do here.
Let's go beyond where we're comfortable from seeing our own home, Earth. Want to go explore.
So this has a very, very different vibe and tone from Science Out Loud, but because we were able to clearly articulate what our goals are and what our strategies are based on those first 7 questions, I think it's very consistent with our overall mission. The framework of 8 questions, like I said, it comes across as very limiting, especially when you're just in an ideation phase, but it gave us a lot of freedom and variability to explore different aesthetics while being consistent with what our mission is. So the final question I could easily spend an entire talk on, and it's how do we assess success, which is really hard to do, just as evidenced by the fact that it's really hard for us to answer the question, how do I define something that's meaningful? Obviously, there are things like numerical analytics, the view counts, the shares, the percent watched. But what I really think is important is considering all those pieces in a constellation of different data sets and different data points to help you map your outcomes to your intent. So did we achieve what we set out to do? And if we didn't, is there anything interesting to be gleaned from it? And it really relies on you to rigorously go through the first 7 questions so that you have a clear idea of what you set out to do. So the numbers aren't useless. I think in particular they're very helpful when you look at trends. So if one of our goals was to broaden MIT's reach, to get people engaged in general over the years, PY stands for production year, so this is going from November of 2011 to November of 2012, the first data point. We have pretty consistent growth in views, comments, shares, and new subscribers. Then you also have some perplexing graphs. In particular, there's this one, that our percent watch has not really changed over the past 6 years. And at first glance, that seems like a bad thing, especially since people are only watching 40% of our videos on average. In the context of YouTube, that's not really that bad. I can't find what the average YouTube educational video watch length is, though. But in the context of MOOCs, this is not very good. But when you go back to mapping outcomes to intent, if our intent is to spark people's curiosity, not to build competencies or help them pass a test, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing that they're only watching 40% of our videos, especially if they're still sharing, still commenting, and still continuing to watch videos down the line. The graph that I am the most proud of is this one. So in its first year, our YouTube audience was about 17% female. And last year, our audiences were almost 50-50. And I think a lot of it came from the braces video. But because we're evaluating all these graphs and numbers in the context of our intent, I think it's pretty powerful that the gender of our audience has evened out over time. So what are some of the other stars in this constellation? Well, a big thing that I've learned over the past couple years is comment types. So I go through and read every single comment on the videos. And the downside to YouTube is that you do get trolls. But the plus side is that you get these unprompted, less biased reactions. So self-reported surveys are notorious for having biases built in. But when you have YouTube comments, it's kind of like having this think aloud process where people are just reacting like they normally would. And I see the comments falling into 4 types, essentially, which is sense of wonder. So people just saying, like, wow, this is awesome. Anecdotal, so they're connecting what they learned in the video to something in their real life. So in one of the comments, someone's saying, like, oh, I've always wondered like how my VR set works. The video was on how virtual reality works. Then you start digging a little deeper, I feel like, with clarification. So there was a video on the physics of skydiving, and one of the viewers was kind of confused on how Newton's second law was explained, and then one of the other viewers jumped in and helped clarify. And then finally, inquiry-based, and this is where we're seeing people grappling with the content, that they're asking probing questions based off of what they hear. So, for example, there was a video we did on the science of warp drives, and someone asked, like, is this how we could maybe time travel? It's not that one level is better than the other. I think they represent different levels of the way people are making meaning with the videos. But I think this categorization system is useful when you're evaluating the success of a material, because it basically makes visible otherwise invisible processes in kids. You kind of see their thinking process, which I think is very powerful. And then, of course, the other stars in the constellation are sort of the unprompted anecdotes and emails and messages that we get from people. In particular, so this is very long, but essentially the gist of it is that there was a mother in California who emailed Quentin, who's the host of Q's View, and talking about her daughter, who is half Latina, half black. Now she doesn't know any scientists to look up to, and she was very excited to watch Q's View. And they made a trip out to MIT just to visit him. So that's Isabella. She's 8 years old. She met Quentin, and then Quentin set her up with a couple very awesome young Black and Latina women on campus. So she got to spend the day with them and go to Massey. And she is very determined to be MIT class of 2021. She wants to major in aerospace engineering. But a lot of that came from, this little simple message that she sent us. And then we have a quote from one of the teachers who was involved with our SciVids 101 workshop. So we involve students who are in the Boston area, but for a lot of them, when they come, it's their very first time to MIT, even though they live here. So we had a group go with the media lab, and they made videos about the different research. So here's a group with the Opera of the Future lab over there. And the teacher just talks about how the kids can stop talking about what they saw. And then finally, this is a blog post from a student who was involved with our media production class. And she said, I talk science to my colleagues every day, so the types of conversations I engage in and the writing I do seem to be skewed more towards the technical side. Because this style has become so second nature, it was difficult to write with an accessible and conversational voice. For the hosting portion, to be honest, I felt really shy and nervous, but I'm glad I tried it. And all the coaching to help me be on camera, this was the best class I've taken at MIT. It challenged me to step outside my comfort zone, to try new things, and to appreciate the process as much as, or more than, the final product. And I don't put that up there just to toot my own horn. It's definitely a very team effort. Whitney is over in the corner. She just got her PhD in chemistry. And then there's Sari, who is our TA, also a former student, was one of our educational media fellows, and now she's actually working for SciShow as a writer. George is a fellow alum who directs all of our videos and is very involved in the class. So all of these pieces come together to create this constellation. Here are the numbers that I think most people would jump to, but again, when you consider all those pieces, in addition to the anecdotes that we got, in addition to the comment types, I think we get a much richer picture of the type of impacts that we've made in leveraging our students to help inspire future generations of scientists and engineers. I think the most powerful impact that we've had is actually related to identity. So at a place like MIT, I would say that creative stakes are our currency. So if MIT students felt like they had a legitimate hand in something that was important, in something that mattered to them, that built up their portfolio, that gave them a skill that was useful outside of this place, that helped them talk about what they're passionate about, I think they would do it even if they didn't get paid. And additionally, for people in audiences like Isabella, equipping them with identities of future explorers of the world, like Jeff Corwin did for me, I think that's really where our most important impact was. So I can sum up all of the lessons that we've learned in the past 6 years with one last story. So in ancient Greece, there was a high priestess who was considered to be the oracle for Apollo. And at the temple of the Oracle of Delphi, there were a bunch of precepts carved into the walls, and my middle school Latin teacher kept 3 of them hung over his wall. And they were, know thyself, nothing in excess, and a pledge comes from madness, which is basically like, don't make promises you can't keep. And I found that these frameworks are very powerful for approaching creative media production. I think they pretty much encapsulate those 8 questions, and they've also been very helpful for me throughout my whole life. So with that, I encourage you all to start thinking about what you want to make. Thank you, guys.